Good evening, everyone. My name is Douglas Sprang, and I lead the Energy and Environment series for the MIT Club of Northern California. Our mission is to feature top speakers doing groundbreaking work in the fields of renewable energy, electric vehicles, storage systems, and climate change. And welcome to 2025. I'm sure it goes without saying that we should expect a different approach to energy and climate policy in the next 4 years with the new administration. What makes it more dramatic is the approach of the Biden administration and the presumed approach of the incoming Trump administration are radically different, creating much uncertainty as to where our country may be headed in this crucial area of government. Tonight's event features one of the most knowledgeable and forthright speakers on these issues, Chris Knittel, professor and associate dean at the MIT Sloan School of Management. He will present his view on how the next 4 years may unfold in these uncertain times. Now, we have enabled live Q&A, which I will forward to our moderator during the Q&A session at the end to complement the questions we got from online registration. And we recommend for your best viewing experience to put your Zoom view in gallery mode to get the feel of a fireside chat. Now, I would like to welcome back Matt Cheng Zedler to our Energy and Environment program as moderator for tonight's event. Hi, Matt.
Hey, thank you, Doug. And good evening, everyone. As Doug mentioned, I am an undergrad MIT alum, course 2 mechanical engineering, and volunteer with the MIT Club of Northern California's Energy and Environment track. I am especially excited to be moderating this talk with Professor Knittel tonight because my day job is working on deploying advanced lithium-ion batteries, and we spent a lot of time between November 5th and January 20th trying to read the tea leaves on what a second Trump administration means for clean energy. My first introduction to Chris was when I listened to the What If It Works podcast put out by the MIT Energy Initiative in early December. In that episode, he indicated that offshore wind and electric vehicle subsidies were likely under threat. We've already seen executive action in both those areas, so make sure to pay attention to Chris tonight. Now to some quick housekeeping before we get started. Just as a reminder, Doug indicated that we're enabling the live Q&A, and Doug's going to help me get as many of those questions as I can into the session after Chris's presentation. Though past experience suggests we won't get to them all. We will also answer many of the questions we got from online registration. With that out of the way, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Christopher Knittel tonight. Chris is the Associate Dean for Climate and Sustainability, the George P. Schultz Professor, and a Professor of Applied Economics at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Additionally, he leads 2 MIT research centers, the Climate Policy Center, and the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, the latter of which was started in response to the oil shocks of the 1970s. Before MIT, Professor Knittel taught at the University of California, Davis, and at Boston University. Chris holds a BA in Economics and Political Science from California State University, Stanislaus, an MA in Economics from the University of California, Davis, and a PhD in Economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Chris, before we get started with your presentation, I would like to ask you a few questions.
Sure.
Yeah. In case our audience missed it, you have spent a lot of time in the great state of California. What do you miss the most from the Golden State when you are in Cambridge?
Well, that question's an easy one because I think the high today was 11. So I must say I do miss the weather. And ironically enough, I miss the snow as well because the West Coast skiing is much better than East Coast skiing. Oh, I should add, I have family in California, so in case they're listening, I miss them too. Trust me.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I don't miss those Cambridge winters. I looked through the list of papers you've published on your website, which is knittel.world for anybody who's looking. And there's a strong focus in the energy and environment space. Can you talk about what drove you into energy and environment as your research focus?
Yeah, when I entered undergrad, actually, I was convinced I was going to be an attorney. But I took my first economics class my freshman year and fell in love with it. And then at that time, I always knew I wanted to be thinking about how markets work and how regulation affects markets and questions like that. I didn't necessarily fall on energy until my time at Berkeley. So I was a research assistant at the UC Energy Institute.
Hmm.
And there, around that time period, it was the late 90s. And if you remember back then, we were restructuring electricity markets. They were very dynamic. There were lots of open questions about what a restructured electricity market even looks like and will it work and so on. So I kind of fell in love with energy via those important questions. And after that, I moved into mostly fossil fuel market research, and then I've kind of come back to electricity markets because in the world we expect to see at some point, most of our energy is going to be coming from the electricity market.
Gotcha. Yeah, very, very, very cool. I think I'll throw this one in there. You mentioned on your podcast or on the podcast from MIT that you drive a fossil powered vehicle with a certain license plate,
Yeah.
and I'd love it if you wanted to share a little bit more about your car choice and your license plate choice and what you're trying to share with that.
Yeah, that might even be in my slides at some point.
Oh.
So I drive, I'll admit it, I drive a Bronco, but I will say that I take it off road. And in fact, the reason why my wife allowed me to buy a Bronco is because my then Audi SUV got stuck multiple times on the beach when we were vacationing with friends who had Land Rovers, and so up until then, she would have fought that purchase. But my license plate is tax CO2. I do get asked. I have been asked numerous times. Isn't that a bit ironic or at odds with the vehicle? And actually, from an economist perspective, it's not. Right. So the right policy is a carbon tax to address climate change. And what that would, some people would change which vehicles they buy, but not everybody. And I probably wouldn't be one of them. Once they electrify the Bronco, I will certainly be first in line.
Yeah, no, great commentary on it. I think we've seen some of that obviously under the Biden administration with the EV tax credits, which are already changed now under Trump. But it is interesting to see how stick and carrots can really influence behavior. So
Yeah.
one last one for you. As a professor, you have done a lot of teaching in your career, and I noticed on the website that you were awarded the MIT Undergraduate Economic Association's Professor of the Year Award for the last academic year. I'm curious what lessons you've learned, if any, from teaching MIT undergrads.
Well, I get humbled every day. MIT undergrads are just amazing. And in fact, the class I teach a undergraduate section of it and a graduate section of it. And I teach the same exact material because the undergrads are just as smart as the graduate students. So they're able to comprehend the same material. It's amazing. The MIT undergrads are just amazing. They come in wanting to change the world, and many of them do.
Awesome. Really appreciate you sharing all this information before we get started. And I'm sure everyone is going to learn a lot from you tonight. So I'll go ahead while you're presenting, I'll turn off my video and allow you to share your screen and advance your own slides. And then when you're done, we'll move into Q&A. I'm sure that's going to be a pretty lively period I'm sure there's a lot of audience questions that we will have. So I'll go dark now and let you take over. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. And certainly thank you for the introduction. So I did put together some slides. as we faculty do. I'm hoping though that we get to spend just as much time as I'm talking with Q&A, and that this isn't just a lecturing. So Matt did a great job of introducing me, but just a few more details. So I wasn't born in California, but I moved there when I was just about to turn 4. Grew up in Fremont and Merced, still have family in both locations. And as Matt mentioned, I'm completely California educated. And in fact, my second academic job was in the UC system, and never thought we would leave UC Davis because it was perfectly located for family reasons, but MIT made it very, very hard to say no back in 2011. And the reason for that is, more than any university I've ever been associated with or dealt with, MIT is very interdisciplinary. There are no walls at MIT in terms of disciplines or even doing research in other disciplines. That the faculty in those departments will open the door for you and want to see more of that. And because I work on climate and energy, and I'm a huge fan of technology, there's no better place than MIT to do the types of projects that I do. So I run a couple centers at MIT, and I'm going to talk actually a fair bit about the second one. So I just wanted to introduce the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research, which Matt briefly mentioned. So it has been around since 1977, and it came about as a result of the oil shocks in the early 70s, when a bunch of economists at MIT realized, hey, nobody's really studying energy markets, and for pretty good reasons. Oil prices had effectively fallen for decades. There was never any concern about that. So a group of economists started CEPR, we call it, and it was a joint initiative between Sloan, the Department of Economics, and then the Energy Lab, and now the MIT Energy Initiative. And the way I always describe it is it's the hub for social science work related to energy and the environment. And that name is very broad. We do projects, research on pure energy topics, like how do you organize a deregulated electricity market? We also do research on pure environmental topics, like what is the impact of local pollution on infant health, and everywhere in between. And I like to think that we've had a lot of meaningful, positive impact on on policy, both in Washington, D.C., internationally, and at the state level. If you want to learn more, please go to cepr.mit.edu. We have a very large working paper series. We run 3 workshops per year, one in D.C., one in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one international workshop. This year's international workshop will be in Warsaw. And our main job is to fund graduate students and postdocs to do research on topics that policymakers need help with. Okay, so that's my introduction. Let me jump right into the material here. So here's what I think will be the outline for my talk. I might drop some slides here and there if I'm running out of time, but the first thing I want to talk about is what the Biden administration did related to climate and greenhouse gas emissions. And in doing so, I want to show you with data where the benefits of those policies are going within the US. Then we'll pivot to what the current administration is doing and is likely to do in the energy and climate space. And I want to end with a discussion of the other research center I run, which is brand new, started last year, called the MIT Climate Policy Center. And that is less about research and more about taking the research that's done at MIT and helping policymakers translate that into actual policy. And I have a couple slide decks teed up in case it pops up in Q&A, but we've been doing a lot of work around data centers and critical minerals. That won't be in the main presentation, but if there's questions about that, I'm happy to talk about that. Okay, so here's a kind of good news, bad news. More than I would have ever expected, the Biden administration had huge impacts on our trajectory for greenhouse gas emissions. If you would ask me if this was at all possible at the beginning of 2020, I would have put the odds very low, which maybe that means you shouldn't listen to me when I tell you what I think is going to happen in the next 4 years. But the bills that the Biden administration was able to pass were quite consequential. And that's the good news. The bad news is that means undoing them will also be, or could also be, consequential. So what were those bills? So the first one and the biggest one by far is the Inflation Reduction Act. That was passed through reconciliation on a 50-50 vote. So quite easy to undo because it's all budgetary. But then there were two bills that were passed with bipartisan support. So undoing those are going to be difficult, but they weren't as consequential as the Inflation Reduction Act. So we have, I call it the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. The actual act was the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which pumped a fair bit of money into building out a charging network for electric vehicles. And then the CHIPS Act, which is less so about climate, but it was funding more basic science research in solar cells and clean technologies. So that certainly, you can count that as certainly a climate related bill. Then we have another change, which for many of you probably just flew under the radar. And that's around what's called the social cost of carbon. And I'm going to fill in the details a bit about what that means in a second. But prior to when Biden first took office, that number, which roughly speaking, think of it as the damage from a ton of carbon, and is used in regulatory proceedings for justifying regulations that would reduce carbon. That number went from $52 to $190 a ton. Under the Trump administration, it was $5. So it started in the Obama administration at around $30, went to basically zero. A quick overturn of what Trump did brought it back to $52, but then a study or rulemaking from the EPA got it all the way up to $190. And I'll talk about how that was in a second, but that is a big deal as well, because what that means is when rules are written or laws are passed and we do any cost benefit analysis by the federal government, we're definitely not going to be using $190 a ton. So it'll be easy to pass rules that increase greenhouse gas emissions. So like I said, this is a double-edged sword. So now we need to start thinking about what can Trump do to undo these impacts. So how big of an impact was the Inflation Reduction Act? So this is work from my colleague, Catherine Wolfram at the Sloan School of Management with a group of co-authors, Bisline being the first. And what they do is they run a bunch of models that we economists or energy modelers use to think about or estimate how different policies would impact greenhouse gas emissions. So there's about 5 models there that you could see, and the yellow ones are with the Inflation Reduction Act, and the blue ones are without the Inflation Reduction Act. And the take-home message here is that most of the modeling suggests that the Inflation Reduction Act led to a 10 percentage point reduction in US emissions from 2020 to 2035. Also on that graph, you'll see the 2030 target of 50% reductions below 2005 by 2030. And the Inflation Reduction Act wasn't enough. So we still had work to do, or the Harris administration would have still been looking to pass laws and rules that would lead to more emission reductions. What was in the Inflation Reduction Act, for those of you that don't live and breathe this stuff? It was a bunch of carrots. Let's be honest. It was subsidies for effectively anything that reduced greenhouse gas emissions. So the big ones were the $7,500 tax credit that Matt mentioned on electric vehicles, and an investment tax credit for green electricity that is usually taken by solar, a production tax credit for green electricity, and you can only pick one. Wind usually takes a production tax credit. Clean energy manufacturing subsidies, subsidies for carbon capture, utilization and sequestration, subsidies for green hydrogen, subsidies for clean or energy efficiency investments. So lots and lots of subsidies. It was a big outlay of money. The CBO scored the bill at around $400 billion. And in fact, that score was way low, much lower than all the modeling I've seen. That same group of co-authors that I showed you before modeled the Inflation Reduction Act, and their score, which is not official, but their score, their central score is around $900 billion. So more than twice of what the CBO expected the cost of the Inflation Reduction Act. So if you're a deficit hawk, repealing the Inflation Reduction Act is a great thing. Where was the discrepancy between the CBO and that more academic modeling? The biggest chunk was in electric vehicles. So you could see the first bar chart there. The gray one, the middle one is how much the CBO expected the tax credits for electric vehicles to be. And they were projecting way lower EV penetration than anyone thinks is likely to be the case. But there were other discrepancies as well. So 45V there, that's the dark red. Those are the green hydrogen subsidies. So you don't always get this in the models, hydrogen, the hydrogen economy starting, but in some of the models you will. And the CBO was expecting almost zero green hydrogen over the life of the Inflation Reduction Act. And the third big discrepancy is how much carbon capture and sequestration we would do. And most of the models that I've seen suggest we would do way more than the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, this low score might actually help the Inflation Reduction Act in a kind of roundabout way, and I'll make that I'll keep that in suspense for a while. I mentioned the social cost of carbon, which the technical definition is if I release a ton of carbon today, that's going to lead to marginally more climate change. And what are the damages over the life of that ton of CO2 from that extra climate change? And remember, that ton of CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. So you have to add up all those costs over the full life. The red graph there is what the official number has been for the U.S. federal government, and you can see it started under the Obama administration. There was a revision that kicked it up to $40 a ton, and I mentioned earlier that it was at $190 a ton. And if you don't live and breathe this stuff, what does $190 a ton mean? So a gallon of gasoline, if I burn it, leads to 20 pounds of CO2 being released into the atmosphere. So take that 190 and divide it by 100, and that is the damage in dollar terms that a gallon of gas does to the globe over the life of that 20 pounds of CO2. So $1.90 a gallon is quite substantial from that gallon of gasoline. All right, so here's, and I'm going to say hope, but here's the hope for the Inflation Reduction Act, or at least parts of it sticking around. And where it's going to come from is where the money is going now. So one, I'm going to show you a couple graphs that hopefully convince you, at least suggest to you, that the Inflation Reduction Act sped up investment. That's not a big leap of faith, since it's handing out a lot of money to make green investment. In this graph, you don't really see it. You don't see it perfectly, right? There, if I squint, I kind of see a shift in the slope of those bars. But if I zoom in on, let's say, manufacturing, then I see it quite a bit. Or it's certainly easier to convince me that the Inflation Reduction Act really sped up manufacturing. And in particular, stare at that blue chart, Matt's industry, right? So the blue part of those bars is the investment in manufacturing of batteries in the US. And by far, that has been the biggest increase in dollar terms. And the gray one at the bottom is investment in critical minerals, which in percentage terms has been a big increase as well. So we think it's leading to more money going into clean technologies. If I look at where it's going in energy, it's wind, solar, and storage. Some of us might wish it was going more into nuclear, especially technologies like small modular reactors. But so far, it's the wind and solar on the generation side, and battery storage on the generation and load side. If we look at which industries are getting the most investment, and here I circle the y-axis because we've gone down by an order of magnitude, right? So the big money is going toward things like EVs, energy. We are seeing investment in industry, but it's an order of magnitude smaller than there. But where is the investment there? It's in sustainable aeronautic fuels, and a bit in hydrogen and carbon sequestration. I think what's more interesting, though, is where it's going geographically. So if you plot, and we just generated this graph today, or this map today, this is all the way up to quarter 3 of 2024. And I should say these data come from the CEPR, the center I run, and Rhodium have been generating these data called the Clean Investment Monitor. You can download the data. You can play around with some maps on the website, but it's one of the things that we're trying to add to the discussion around investment. We're not claiming, nobody's claiming that this is all because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So let's be clear there. But this is where money in clean technology is going across the US. And what I've done here is, so the size of the circle is how much money has gone to that congressional district. So I've split the US into congressional districts. And the color of the circle represents how that congressional district voted in the 2024 election. So what I take from this is most of the money, in fact, over 80% of the money, is going toward red districts. And I should also, one caveat to this is announced money. So this isn't all steel in the ground, which might make policymakers even more scared because they can undo these announcements. But like I said, most of the money is going toward red districts. That's partly not surprising because most of the land mass in the US is a red district. So if I were to just throw a dart randomly at the US, I'm much more likely to hit a red district. But I don't, if I'm a congressman from one of these districts, I don't care if it was random or not. I care that this is investment going to in my district, and I might fight for that. That's all across all technologies. We have this very interesting phenomenon going on in the US where we now have what we call the battery belt, which is, you could see this region of the country. That's where almost all of the investment in battery manufacturing is going. And those policymakers are very fearful. And we've had many discussions at the state level and at the federal level, but state representatives, they are scared that that money will dry up. That's a lot of jobs, a lot of permanent jobs that are going to their districts. And they're also selling those batteries to EV manufacturing facilities in their districts or in that region as well. So the strongest argument for some of the Inflation Reduction Act to stick around is, where is the money going? And will policymakers be willing to give up those investments? But we've already had the first move here. So one of the initial executive orders that President Trump signed put a complete pause on all IRA and infrastructure funds. That includes the electric vehicle mandate. It includes any new money going to battery manufacturers, the full gamut. It is technically just a pause. So I'm sure there will be discussions when they have their own reconciliation package. I'll come back to that in a second, because there's something else that's going away in 2025 that is going to get a lot of focus. But at least initially, it seems like the president is willing to see these subsidies go away. And he's also disbanded the intergovernmental working group on the social cost of carbon, like he did during his first administration. So there's already the first indication that a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act is likely to go away. If I were to venture a guess, and I'm not betting on these probabilities, so I'm not putting my money where my mouth is, so take this with a grain of salt. But I think what the new administration is likely to do is be much more surgical with what it gets rid of in terms of the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill. There are these offshore wind mandates or add-ons in terms of tax incentives. I'm almost sure those are going to go away. All the offshore wind is in blue states. It seems like an easy win for the new president to get rid of those. The EV tax credit, I would say, is likely to go away. Elon Musk has signaled that he doesn't like it. There's some interesting economics there. I can completely see why he doesn't like it. He's further along in the learning curve for EVs than other manufacturers. So if he could, getting rid of those tax credits are going to hurt his competitors a lot more than him. So I would view his indication that he's not in favor of it as a credible argument. And then we start to get into, I think, more coin flip type subsidies. Will the administration be willing to get rid of the solar investment tax credit? I say it's much less likely he would get rid of the utility scale solar tax credit. Probably more likely he'd get rid of the rooftop solar tax credit. Probably likely get rid of heat pump subsidies and energy efficiency subsidies. I doubt although I think this is a pure coin flip, so I guess I don't doubt, but I can see him not getting rid of the sustainable aviation fuel tax credit. Certainly the airlines want that, not just for the US, but those airlines are regulated in other regions of the world, especially in Europe, where having that access to more sustainable aviation fuel is important. And then the ones that I can't imagine going away are the clean manufacturing subsidies because of that battery belt, the hydrogen subsidies, which the oil companies really want, and the carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration subsidies, which the oil companies really want as well. My guess, though, is that he'll take them away and rebrand them in some other reconciliation bill, so he can say, I got rid of the entire Inflation Reduction Act. But the true essence of those won't go away. And this is supported by a letter that 18 House Republicans wrote to Speaker Johnson. I think only 14 of them are still in office, saying, please don't get rid of the Inflation Reduction Act. And not surprisingly, they are in regions or congressional districts that are getting a lot of money. So there'll be some back and forth in these discussions. But like I said, I think they'll completely go away in name, but then come back under a new named act. How about all of energy policy? So the Trump administration is likely to drill. Chris Wright comes from the fracking industry, his DOE pick. We're going to see more drilling. We'll see red tape going away. I should be upfront. Like, oil production in the U.S. went up during the Biden administration, so it wasn't as though he was shutting down a lot of areas. But there are certainly areas in Alaska that might be opened up. That's going to bear a lot of oil, a lot of natural gas. Because of how oil markets work, it's not likely to lower the price of oil because oil is a global market. And even if we increased our production by, say, 20% or even 50%, that's only a 5% increase in global oil production. So it's not likely to have a huge impact on the price of oil, but it'll have a huge impact on the bottom lines of oil companies. Natural gas is more interesting. So we'll be drilling for more natural gas. We'll also be exporting more natural gas. So the Biden administration put a pause on permitting for new LNG, liquefied natural gas, export terminals. That pause is lifted. We'll be building more of those terminals, which means we'll be exporting more of that natural gas out. So when you combine drill baby drill with export baby export, the impact on US consumers is ambiguous. I would not be surprised, in fact, if the price of natural gas went up in the US, even though we're producing more, because that natural gas is more valuable outside of the US, in Europe and in Asia. So don't expect your natural gas bill to fall over the next 4 years. Some other open questions. I think the Trump administration is going to focus on infrastructure, especially with Wright as Secretary of Energy. We need more infrastructure. We need more power lines. The natural gas and oil industry argues we need more pipelines, but we certainly need more transmission lines and more investment in the grid more generally. That could have potential benefits, climate benefits, because if we extend the transmission network, we can bring in some of the cheap renewable resources that aren't connected to the grid yet. The biggest question I have, and I'll admit it's a fear, is if you might notice that President Trump is invoking the term national security a lot in those executive orders. And I think he's positioning himself to use that as an excuse potentially to ban or outlaw state level policies, which during the first administration, what counterbalanced the upward pressure on greenhouse gas emissions from the Trump administration actions were state and local policies. And if he's successful, I'm sure it would be, I know it'll be challenged. And I kind of doubt he'll be successful, but if it was successful, he can get rid of the California waivers for stricter fuel economy standards, potentially renewable portfolio standards in electricity markets and clean energy standards, maybe even energy efficiency standards. Maybe he could force fracking in New York, which has a ban. Who knows? So that's an open question to keep your eye on. And then, like I said, I'm intrigued as an economist as to what will be the domestic price effect of all of this natural gas coming in or coming out of the ground and going out of the U.S. And then with the discussion about tariffs on Canadian oil, that could have potential implications. So a little bit of oil markets for you. The U.S. on average is basically self-sufficient. So we take as much oil out of the ground as we consume, but we also import and export. So how can those two things be true? So what we do is when we take our oil out of the ground, especially in areas like the Bakken, that oil is very light and sweet. It's very high value oil. But our refineries in the Gulf Coast are set up to refine pretty crappy oil, to be honest, heavy sour oil. So how the market corrects for that is we take our light sweet oil, we export it to other countries and get a price premium for that, and import from Canada tar sands, which are super heavy and super sour, not even oil, believe it or not, and refine that product. So if Canada shuts us off, or certainly sells us less because of a tariff, we'll now be imbalanced in terms of our oil. So that'll be an interesting question, like how much inefficiency will that create and whether or not that'll put upward pressure on US gasoline prices. Something to watch for. Okay. Some other questions and things that are, if you're looking for the glass is half full argument, I already mentioned that I would expect the new administration to invest heavily in electricity infrastructure. And then a second glass is half full is all of this natural gas, if it stays here in the US, will speed up and accelerate coal plant retirement. My own work and the work of Jim Stock at Harvard suggests that the majority of the cause of coal plant retirements has been cheap natural gas, not lots of renewables. So that will certainly in the near term have a downward pressure on greenhouse gas emissions. And then the question is what will be the focus on critical minerals and climate-friendly manufacturing like batteries. And then finally, tariffs. The Trump administration has signaled he's going to be an active user of tariffs. There's push within the GOP ranks at the House level and the Senate level to tie tariffs to greenhouse gas emissions. Why, you might ask? Because a lot of the Chinese products are dirtier than our domestic products. So there's a legitimate argument to say we're going to tax, if you're above our carbon intensity on your steel or your whatever product you're thinking, fertilizer, whatever it is, we're going to tax you on that difference as an anti-China policy, but it'll have potential climate benefits. And then all this discussion about reliability and resiliency is good news for renewables and low carbon electricity sources. So the big wild card, and I briefly mentioned this, is the expiration of the Trump tax cuts. That's $1.9 trillion worth of tax cuts. So if the Trump administration wants to renew those, what that means is if you add in a non-trivial number of deficit hawks, it's going to mean that they need to find 1.9 trillion or close to it of spending cuts or extra revenues. So this is where actually the conservative CBO ranking of IRA is not going to help them much, because at most they're going to get 400 billion from repealing all of IRA. But you know, they're certainly going to do some of it, especially the EV portion of it, I would imagine. The glass is super half full argument here is maybe, just maybe, they'll do what my license plate suggests they should do and adopt a carbon tax as a revenue generator. And that would have profound impacts on greenhouse gas emissions. So there's other academic work that suggests you could get all of the carbon reductions from the Inflation Reduction Act with only a $10 carbon tax. So even a modest carbon tax would generate lots of revenues and lead to big greenhouse gas emissions. So if you don't believe that my license plate is tax CO2, it was recently on the MIT website. A bunch of faculty with personalized license plates had the photo of their cars there. All right. Finally, I want to pivot a little bit to ask the question, how can MIT help over the next 4 years and beyond? And this is where I want to describe the Climate Policy Center a little bit. So that's the second center I run. And in doing so, I'm going to, it'll allow me to describe the Climate Project, which is launched last year under new President Kornbluth. And I can hopefully get into even more details in the Q&A on that. So Sally took office in 2023, and climate was, we were all nervous, right? You get a new president, you don't know what that new president is going to focus on. There's so many important topics in the world that she could have chosen from, but every meeting I was in with her, she brought up climate as her number one focus. And she, for the old timers out there, she equates it to the rad lab. So MIT's invention of radar and the importance and the all of MIT challenge that climate change is to society. So she invested $50 million to what ended up being called the Climate Project. And that's just a starting point. So they're fundraising like crazy around the Climate Project. And what this 50 million is allowing us to do is come up with some early impactful wins that we could show and signal to society that we can do a lot more here. And what the Climate Project did is it created 5 pillars or missions, and you could see who's leading each of those missions. One is decarbonizing energy and industry. One is focused on atmosphere and the oceans. Another one is focused on vulnerable communities. The fourth one's focused on buildings, and the fifth one is on policy. And I'm the mission director for policy, but that's not the MIT Climate Policy Center. So you might be wondering why does this guy Knittel need all these centers for one, or these things? And I'm gonna describe the gap that the MIT Climate Policy Center is meant to fill. So the MIT Climate Policy Center came about via a $25 million gift from my now former dean, Dave Schmidtlein. He announced this. He told me about it in December of 2023. And that allowed us to launch the center in the spring of 2024. So what's it all about? So it comes out of a white paper that myself and two colleagues wrote back in 2021, I think, that really laid out why or where the holes are or gaps are from turning research into actual policy. And my motivation of that has been a frustration of mine throughout my career of, I write a paper that I think is important. I think it's influential potentially. But believe it or not, senators and the president and House members aren't reading that paper and immediately writing a bill based on that paper. So what can we do to help along that process? To inject more research into the policy formation process. It's meant to solve three problems. One is, and this is why I love being at MIT, the motto at MIT is let 1,000 flowers bloom. So if I were to just look at climate, what research centers on campus work on climate? This is just a subset. So we have CEPR, which I mentioned. We have the Sustainability Initiative. MCSC is a new center. So many centers doing tremendous research on climate. Some on the technical side, only a few on the policy side, but certainly on the engineering and technical side, we have lots and lots of research centers there. But those flowers never or rarely talk to each other, or they certainly don't talk to each other enough. So one of the problems that this center is trying to solve is being the connective tissue, if you will, across all of these centers and keeping an eye on what these centers are doing from a policy perspective. How is what they're working on policy relevant, and letting all the centers know what the other centers are doing. The second problem we're trying to solve is that one I mentioned, which is, this is just an example. We just put out this paper a couple weeks ago looking at how electricity prices are dynamic and how should we price electricity given that dynamic nature of wholesale electricity prices. I think it's 70 pages. The key graph is on page 31. And I have this sneaky suspicion that most policymakers aren't making it to page 31 of this paper. So unless there's somebody who can distill and translate this research for the policymakers, and not just my own, I'm just using this as an example, this result would never get turned into potentially useful policy. The third problem is policy's hard, and we academics aren't good at it, nor should we be. This is just the ecosystem map that one of our colleagues created for DC. And then there's a state level one and a local one, an international one, and so on. So if you want to have an impact, you need to know this map, and you need to know the key person in each of these cells and so on. So what do we do? So here's an example of what we do. So this is an example where a policymaker came to MIT and said, hey, I have this bill. So Senator Hickenlooper's office came to us late or middle of last year. Senator Hickenlooper had a bill that called the Big Wires Act, which would build more transmission, interregional transmission in the US. And he came to MIT, he came to the MIT Policy Lab, or his staff did, and asked, hey, we noticed this researcher at MIT has done some modeling on what transmission does to electricity markets. Will you have or ask if he'll model our bill? That researcher was at the is in the MIT Energy Initiative. The researcher said, I'd love to, but I don't have time. I'm on grants. I got to write my next grant. I just don't have time. Fortunately, this was before the Climate Policy Center was started. Fortunately, I cobbled up some money to hire a postdoc, and I was having that postdoc learn the model that we use at MIT to model electricity markets. We went to Juan Senga, is his name, brilliant postdoc. I said, Juan, drop everything you're doing. You got to model this bill for the senator's office. If any of you have been in academia, you know the typical academic would do that in over a 6-month period. In 3 weeks, Juan had modeled the bill. The next week, we flew down to Washington, D.C. We debriefed the Hickenlooper's office. We wrote a research commentary summarizing our results. That research commentary made it in their press release, and they're using that or giving that to other senators to get more co-sponsors on the bill. I'll be clear, we don't lobby. We're not lobbying. We're just providing evidence on what the bill would do. If they want to use that evidence, whatever it is, but the evidence is going to be in the public domain no matter what. After we did that, we finished up the academic paper. So there was just a slight detour on how the typical academic process works, but that's a detour an academic has really no incentive to do. In our analysis, we look at the impacts of the bill on emissions, on costs, on resiliency, and on electricity trade. They asked us to look at some other things, but we didn't feel comfortable, or we didn't think we could accurately model those, so we said we wouldn't do that. Once we did that, Congressman Kazar from Texas, who has another bill that would connect Texas to the rest of the US, heard about what we did, and he asked if we would model his bill. We were able to do that in a couple weeks, put out the paper, got a lot of press, mostly because our results suggest that had Winter Storm Uri, had they been interconnected during Winter Storm Uri, they would have had 80% lower outages than they did under an unconnected grid. So again, we're not advocating for the bill, but we're providing data to policymakers. There's no chance Texas is ever going to interconnect between you and me. But at least now they know what the cost, the opportunity cost of that decision is. We're just providing the data to the policymakers. I'm gonna just a couple, I'll skip this one actually, because both of those were where the policymaker came to us with a policy, but the policy center is meant to be a two-way street where we also come to the policymakers with our research. And a couple examples of that. I mentioned Catherine Wolfram before, who did all that work modeling the Inflation Reduction Act. A big chunk of her research is trying to understand methane emissions and trying to measure methane emissions across sources of natural gas and oil. She's written several papers, very policy relevant papers on, for example, what would an international agreement on methane emissions potentially look like. The Climate Policy Center supported putting her in contact with representatives from Congress, and that contact actually led to a bill. It didn't pass, but it just shows you where that House member wouldn't have known about her research without us being able to connect the dots. And that House member was so intrigued by that research that they're continuing the conversation and focusing on these methane type policies. So that's an example where we took the research to the policymakers. One quote unquote win on that side of the street is we've done a lot of work on the impact of real-time data in an electricity charging network on EV penetration. And we can show with modeling and empirical evidence that if charging stations were required to post their data, not on a website, but just have it as an API so that the Googles and the Apples of the world can grab the data and know which charging station is available and working, that EV adoption would increase. So this is joint with the Salata Institute at Harvard, where we've been doing that research. Then we did a convening where we got all the stakeholders in the room to see what sorts of policy levers could we pull to implement this. We then took that to Massachusetts state representatives, and a provision in the new climate bill, the Massachusetts climate bill, requires all charging stations that take either federal or state money to have that API that we suggested. Again, if in the typical academic world, it would stop only at the writing the academic papers. So we really see hope for the Climate Policy Center having an impact, even in this administration, right? Because I'll go back to the electricity modeling work. What we find in the Hickenlooper bill or the Kasten bill, or Sean Kasten, a representative in Illinois, also has a bill, the big impacts, or a big impact from these infrastructure bills, is an increase in resiliency and reliability. So in this paper, what we did is we modeled the winter storm that took out, I think it was 50% of the natural gas plants in North and South Carolina. And we show that under the Hickenlooper bill, that we would have got a 60% reduction in outages from that winter storm. So there are non-climate benefits to bills that have climate benefits. And I think what the next 4 years is going to focus on, certainly those non-climate benefits, but a lot of them have substantial climate benefits. So I'll skip this one as well. So let me just wrap up, and hopefully we could have a conversation. And I'm trying to be an optimist. By nature, I'm an optimist, and I partly am an optimist, certainly relative to the norm in this setting, because of what I just said. That a lot of Republicans in DC, even if they're not overtly saying it, care about climate and are thinking about bills that would have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But their focus is going to be on these co-benefits. And that could be existing provisions within IRA and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill and the CHIPS bill. It could be these ideas of taxing at the border Chinese products based on their carbon intensity. Even if they don't mean it at all, I think the next 4 years are going to see an increase in coal retirements because of the increase in drilling for natural gas. And sadly, seeing the wildfires in California, there will be, for the next foreseeable future, a focus on adaptation, even if we don't say it's adaptation because of climate change, on building out our infrastructure to be more resilient. And those are going to lead to greenhouse gas reductions or make us more resilient to the climate change that is happening and will continue to happen. And what I'm excited about is I think MIT is well positioned to have an impact. I didn't mention this when I talked about the Climate Policy Center. It is openly bipartisan. We are working with GOP members now. I won't give you the details on that, but we are actively seeking to work with both sides of the aisle. In fact, I don't even like to say the aisle. We're looking to work with policymakers across the political spectrum on issues that respond to climate change or respond to natural disasters, or are just increasing our resiliency to weather events, if you want to call that. So with that, I'll stop, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed that, especially the sections talking about some of the research you have done, and appreciated you putting up the photos of the students who had helped. That was nice to see. We had a lot of good questions that we'll get through some of them. One that came up in the chat, and I thought might be a good place to start is, you alluded to the fact that Trump is really kind of evoking more of a national security um, stance in regards to energy, and he's declared this energy emergency. Um, do you have any sense on how likely it is that the courts uphold that we're in an energy emergency that would necessitate such national security measures, or is that likely to get some pushback?
It'll certainly get pushback, and I hesitate to make projections on legal decisions, but what is he gonna say? It's tough to. It, I guess he's gonna need to vocalize what the threat is, right?
Mm.
And it's hard for me to even put a thumb on something that's even partially believable on that. So the first thought I had was he's going to try to get rid of renewable portfolio standards, which push out more solar and wind, as you know, because of their intermittency, right? The sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow. But in a court case, he'd have to point to, all right, what national security threat is that intermittency leading to? Is China going to wait for the lights to go out and then invade because the lights went out? And it's hard to even point to where it's showing up in the data, right?
Right.
During Winter Storm Uri, people tried to point to the frozen windmills as the reason for the collapse in Texas, but there was more natural gas generation down than renewables down. So it's hard. It'll be hard to pass that, but he'll certainly try.
Good. Yeah, no, I think that is actually good to reflect on. Some of these executive orders, you see them come out, and then obviously a lot of them are going to be challenged. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. Another topic that came up in the audience question, and also was one that I had some questions on, was related to transmission and national transmission policy.
Yeah.
Somebody in the audience mentioned Harvard Belford Center and Princeton have both estimated that a new transmission grid will cost nearly $2.4 trillion for an upgrade and new build outs. Is that something where you expect to see a Trump administration do a lot of kind of policy, and what are your thoughts on the economics of building out the grid versus, maybe other options?
Yeah. So I think the new administration will do some of it, but not all of it. So here's an empirical fact that many of your listeners don't know. Certainly, I bet you do, Matt. If let's say I build a new solar farm, I build a new natural gas plant, a wind farm, whatever generation source you want to build, and then I go to the independent system operator that's running the grid there and say, I want to plug my power plant into the grid. In some regions of the country, it'll take me 7 years before I'm allowed to plug that power plant in. Now, of course, that's not how the timing works. I don't build it and then go to them. I'm doing it concurrently. But the current backlog of interconnection, the interconnection queue, is, I think it's averaging between 3 and 4 years nationwide, and in some areas 6 to 7 years.
Yep.
That just can't be, right? You layer on that on top of like 2030 goals, and you think, oh, well, wait, even if we magically built all the zero carbon generation we wanted to, we can't interconnect it by 2030. So that's something that the Trump administration might have a really big positive impact if he goes in and he cuts the red tape. And we have a piece out in Science last year that kind of gives some policy recommendations on how to reduce that interconnection queue. But that's something that I could see this administration tackling. And it's on the load side too. If I build a data center in some regions of the country, I can't interconnect that data center for 2 to 3 years. So all this data center talk and AI talk, we just have to solve that problem. Then the bigger problem, which is more focused on the question, is if I want to build a new power line, it'll take me 10 to 15 years to build that. Now, this is a tough one because there is some red tape there and the need for studies and so on. But a lot of that is just coming from the fact that you have to get all the landowners on that line to agree to sell it to you, the land. And Senator Whitehouse had a bill last term to lead to more transmission to be built. And I think it was like I'm going to get the numbers not exactly right, but it was a 30-page bill that brought up eminent domain 25 times or something like that. So I say that because I don't know how to solve that problem in the US, right? I have a colleague, Paul Joskow, who says the problem with power lines and pipelines is they're long and skinny, which means they go through lots of backyards, right? And it's just so hard to get those stopped and unbuilt.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was curious, you brought up in the presentation, you mentioned there's no chance Texas will ever interconnect. Is that just because of Texas politics, or any other reason there that
Well, this is great.
that statement?
The reason is, so all of ERCOT is wholly inside of Texas. And because of that, very few electrons cross the state border. As soon as you get interstate trade, you open yourself up to federal regulation through the Commerce Clause, because the federal government can regulate interstate trade. So Texas will never interconnect because that would mean the FERC would have jurisdiction, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission would have jurisdiction and be able to regulate them. So they're trading off, less federal oversight with a less resilient grid. Let's be honest, they have to admit that trade-off.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Forgot about the interstate piece.
The Constitution's coming up a lot these days.
Pivoting a little bit, talking about bringing back American manufacturing. That's something Trump has stated. It is interesting. The company I work for, Fluence, is one of the few battery suppliers who actually works with a vendor who's US based in terms of producing US cells. We didn't see as much of that. We saw a lot of announcements, but actually ground being broken. We didn't see as much of that under Biden as maybe was expected. And the questions for you on that is, how feasible is it to actually bring back some of those clean energy technologies to the US, and what is needed to have American manufacturing actually be competitive with Chinese manufacturing, which is where it's primarily happening?
Yeah. So you could subsidize your way out of it, which is what the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to do. And you can see it's having some impact. But that's just not sustainable, really. The subsidies, for budgetary reasons, dry up at some point. An alternative is something that the European market is doing, it's called the CBAM. So the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So for those of you who don't follow the European market, Europe has a cap and trade system for greenhouse gas emissions. So it's like a carbon tax because it leads to trading of permits that hold value. Those permits are trading at about $90 a ton right now. So remember, I told you the social cost of carbon is $190. So pretty high up, right? So that's equivalent to 90-cent tax on gasoline. That by itself puts European manufacturers at a disadvantage because they have to buy these permits, but the Chinese manufacturers and the US manufacturers don't. So just last year started the CBAM, which is when they started with 5 products: steel, concrete, high carbon products. When a ton of steel gets imported into Europe, Europe is going to count the carbon emissions associated with that steel and tax them as if they face that $90 a ton cap and trade price for that steel. So that Chinese steel is going to be taxed at the border. That's the way to get manufacturing here, is to border adjust either greenhouse gas emissions, or I've suggested in a recent paper that we might do that with critical minerals, based on not just their carbon emissions, but their labor practices. If they're not paying a living wage, we tax them such that we act as though they are. And what would the price be had they paid a living wage? That's our only hope, right? Our biggest hope. Is to level the playing field off of measurable, their advantages, but they're kind of artificial advantages that China has, right? Dirtier grid, lower wages, and so on.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean that's kind of interesting, right? To talk about a carbon tax, especially under a Republican administration. One of the questions that came up that maybe you guys have done some work on, or I'm sure you have some thoughts on, but how has support for carbon tax changed over time in the U.S. and why?
Yeah, it certainly hasn't gone up as much as economists want, and we're a broken record. It is like if you hearken back to your econ class at MIT, the first thing you learn is, in the face of an externality, you want to price that externality. It's called a Pigouvian tax. Pigou wrote the original paper all the way back in 1920. And climate change is a classic example of an externality. That's the optimal, efficient way to solve climate change. Unfortunately, actually, the support for carbon tax over the last few years has fallen, I think. I think I read something in Europe, it's fallen as well, because it's become politicized, sadly. The support for electric vehicles has fallen because it's become politicized, right? Now, why would somebody have liked an EV 5 years ago and now all of a sudden wakes up and doesn't like it? It's just, other than the politicization of EVs, there's not can't really explain that, because EVs have just gotten better. So what we need is an honest conversation with the full political spectrum that climate change is real, and how are we going to address it. Pricing pollution through a tax or a cap and trade system is actually the Republican way to deal with environmental problems. In the 1980s, it was George Bush Sr. that signed the Clean Air Act amendments that created a cap and trade system on nitrogen oxide emissions and SO2 emissions in the US. And for decades, Republicans pointed to that as that's the market way for addressing climate change, or for addressing environmental problems. So if we get them to admit climate change is an environmental problem, they're going to want to price it, the pollution, I'm convinced, because that's the most efficient way to do it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I was at least relieved during the congressional hearings. Chris Wright did not deny climate change, and he is an MIT alum, so hopefully he'll be using the services of the the Climate Policy Center. I guess coming back on that too, right? A couple of things you said during the presentation and this kind of talk on tariffs, right? Trump has often said that he's going to bring down prices, but you said don't expect your natural gas bill to fall. There's potentially going to be tariffs in the form of maybe a carbon border adjustment mechanism or something of that ilk. Should we expect Trump to be able to kind of thread that needle, or is that not a feasible option?
If the tariffs get implemented, they're going to raise prices. I think If you're worried about your pocketbook, your only hope is that he's using the threat of tariffs, but it's not what we game theorists call a credible threat. He's not actually going to do it.
Mm.
But he's created enough uncertainty where his quote unquote opponent, many of which are our allies, are afraid he's going to use that. But there's just there's no denying basic economics. A tariff is a tax.
Yeah.
Consumer for many of these products, especially energy, always pays the burden of the tax. It's going to raise prices. Sure, it'll raise revenue, but it'll hurt consumers more than that revenue that's raised.
Yeah, I think that will be quite interesting to see how they deal with that one in particular. So it hopefully, or will, interestingly enough, be soon. I think Trump has mentioned a couple of times February 1st he expects to start doing. So we'll see. Kind of one last question on the content of the presentation, and I have one question on the Climate Policy Center. But there are a couple of asks on specific technologies. But what are your thoughts on Trump and the Republican administration's support for innovative technologies, for energy innovation and support? I mean, Biden had the big loan programs office, which threw a lot of money out to different clean tech technologies that were scaling up. Do you see that type of mechanism, or just really a reduction in bureaucracy coming from Trump?
So there are some technologies that I could see him getting behind, partly because there are big corporations in the U.S. that will be in his ear to get behind. And some of this comes from that border adjustment mechanism in Europe that I mentioned. With the border adjustment mechanism, there is now a premium for green steel, because if you could export that to Europe, it's going to get a very low, it's going to have a competitive advantage because it won't be paying as much on these carbon fees as certainly steel from China. Now, who wants that? So for green steel, we think the technological pathway is probably hydrogen. Green hydrogen, or there's a rainbow of carbon-free hydrogens. There's pink hydrogen, there's turquoise hydrogen, or so on. So green hydrogen needs renewables. Turquoise hydrogen needs nuclear, or not. Pink hydrogen needs nuclear. Turquoise is natural gas. I forget the name of the process where it turns into hard carbon after the fact. And then there's, I forget the color of it, that is using CCUS. So the oil industry is very keen on CCUS and hydrogen. And if they get in his ear, then I could see where we could potentially have subsidies for a green steel industry and a green or low carbon hydrogen industry. And then we get to nuclear. So, my big, and, I'll put all my cards on the table. I think nuclear plays a big role potentially in a zero carbon world. We have to worry about accidents, but that's where we might get pushed towards SMRs, small modular reactors. I could see Chris Wright getting excited. In fact, I think he owns equity, or probably got rid of it, in a small modular reactor company. If they get behind that, that could be a game changer. If we can get the cost of SMRs down, because we could start exporting that technology to regions of the world that are still very reliant on coal. That could have big implications.
Yeah. I agree on some of those technologies, the nuclear piece and maybe the non-green hydrogen in particular. So very interesting. I want to wrap up here with kind of one question, or a couple questions on the centers that you're directing.
Yeah.
There was a couple good questions in the audience about it as well. One was, are there other academic institutions you work with that are kind of pursuing a similar thing? And, is the interest from, are you seeing a similar interest from some congressional representatives now that you have seen in the past, or more interest, less interest? So maybe start there.
Yeah, so there, I don't want to pretend that we're the only one doing this. I think we do have a center that's explicitly designed to do this, but Harvard does a lot of it, and we work a lot with the Harvard Salata Institute. Jim Stock, who's runs that, is a frequent co-author of mine. Princeton's Net Zero with Jesse Jenkins has been very, very influential with Schumer's office, and in many ways wrote or had huge influence on big chunks of the Inflation Reduction Act. There's the Columbia SEPA, I think I forget the direct name of that, but that's Jason Bordoff. Jason was a member of the Obama administration, and is very well tied into DC. And then University of Chicago, my good friend Michael Greenstone runs what's called EPIC there, and they try to have a big policy presence as well. I haven't seen anything that, what's weird about our center is we're hiring more non-academics and academics, right? We're hiring former staffers. We're hiring people to knock on doors and to, have discussions about what we're doing, because it's not there to do research necessarily. We'll fill in the gaps where we have to, but the whole point of it is we're already doing all this great research and nobody is listening to us, or it's not getting brought to the policymakers. So that's where we're kind of different, I would say.
That makes sense. Have you, I think you walked through this, but MIT's administration is not really put any limits on kind of how you guys approach this. It's fully bipartisan. There were a couple questions about whether or not there's any kind of guidance or limits that are put on you from MIT.
Yeah. I've had lots of lawyer conversations because we don't, and really, I think we're more of the constraint than the laws are, but we're not advocates. So I don't start a meeting with, you need to do X, Y, and Z, right? It's, hey, I see you have a bill. This is what we think the impacts of the bill are. Or, hey, did you see this new research that we have, which suggests if a bill like this was written, it would have this impact, right? So it's all about just providing data to the policymakers, not lobbying. I'm not going out, like when we did the Hickenlooper Big Wires Act, I didn't go to anybody and say, you should pass this bill. I said, this is the impact of the bill. You decide, right, whether you want to support it or not. And that's pretty far away from the lobbying line, and for good reason, because we don't want to be viewed as advocates on either side, because we want it to be bipartisan. If we can't work with the full political spectrum, we're just going to chop off half of the potential impact that we might have.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that's definitely the right lens, hopefully, to make change in the next 4 years and help influence that. I want to be cognizant of time for you, especially on the East Coast, as well as our listeners. So thank you very much for this conversation. I really enjoyed getting the chance to talk with you, and also really appreciated everybody who was able to dial in for this. We had a lot of questions we weren't able to get to in the audience chat, but I think there will be a lot of people checking out those centers and checking out your work in the coming months and years. With that said, I'll pass the mic over to Doug to close things out for the MIT Club of Northern California.
Well, thank you, Matt. And also thank you, Chris, for a very direct and clear presentation, first of all, on what you thought might be going or happening in the next 4 years. It was really refreshing to hear, quite honestly, but I did expect it from you. So thank you for doing it. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like, you don't know, but there could be some really good things that come out of all of this that maybe we wouldn't thought about before. and that can be quite good. So thank you for that presentation. And it was really great to hear about the Climate Policy Center. You know, I've always felt that MIT should have a lot of influence on government policy, but it can't be just by, writing papers. It's got to be a little bit more active than that. And this sounds really, really exciting. And so thank you so much for that. Matt, you did a great job being the moderator. Thank you very much. I'm sure we'll probably ask you to do it again.
Thanks, Doug. More than happy to. Yeah.
Yeah. So do you have anything before we close to say to the audience?
Well, first, thank you, Doug and Matt, for the conversation and for the opportunity. My biggest hope here is that this is the start of a conversation. So my email address is my last name at mit.edu. I live and breathe this stuff. I love talking about it. I love having the opportunity to brag about the great things that my colleagues are doing at MIT. So please reach out to me if any of this resonated. And I think the last time I did one of these was in person, just before COVID, if I remember. So this was a little easier to travel, but I'm always happy to have this opportunity. So thanks, Doug.
That's great. You're welcome, Chris.
Yeah.
Okay, Matt, anything, last words?
None from me. Just thanks again, Chris, for taking the time this evening.
Okay.
Good night,
All of you
everybody.
in the audience, thank you so much for participating in this. And we'll hope to see you at the next one. Thank you.
Take care.